Yeah. Okay, well, we might as well get started. We have a hard stop at 12:30 because there's another meeting in here as well too. So guarantee we'll be out on time. I hope, Trevor. Thanks, guys. It's great to see such a great turnout in the middle of the summer. So thank you all for coming, and for those of you online as well. Without further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Trevor. He's going to give an update on some of the work that he's been doing in his lab work. So take it away, Trevor.
You have to wear this,
or at least hold it so they can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Can the people online hear me? We're getting yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Perfect. We can't see. I can't see a screen right now, so I'm just going to assume I'm visible and we're in vision here. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Jen, for setting this up. The seminar today, as described and as you see on the title, this is going to be an update on some of the research we've been doing on nutritional management on robot herds. Not everything, but just some kind of recent results that have come out of our lab. So I'm going to do a little bit of presenting, but two of my grad students, Brandon Van Soest and Clay McWilliams, are going to present some of their research as part of this here as well. Brandon's a PhD student in my lab, is going to be defending tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So this is one of his 4 research chapters that he's going to be talking about. So it's a little bit of a prep for him on that. And feel free to join tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. too on Teams for that. And then Clay will be presenting some of his master's research that he hopes to defend probably in a month or 2. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So this is an area that we've been working on for a number of years in terms of research. Let's see if this is working. Best if I plug that in, right? Correct. And probably the biggest reason why my lab is being focused on this area of robots and not only nutrition in robots, but management of robots, health management, all kinds of challenges and other things associated with the adoption of robotic milking is because we've seen a massive proliferation of the use of robots in Canada in the last, I'm going to say, last 10 years. It goes back 20 to 30 years, but we're currently milking, as you can see on the slide, these are up-to-date numbers, well, as of earlier this year, in terms of the number of Canadian farms with robots that are on milk recording. And so the average as of January this year was 16.5%. Probably without farms that are on milk recording, we're probably pushing 20%, maybe 20 to 25% of cows in Canada being milked with robots at this time. And you can see that here in Ontario, we're right on the average. In the Western provinces, it's even pushing higher numbers, anywhere from 25 to 30% of farms milking with robots. And so that movement has driven a lot of need for research, and we're just kind of scratching the surface on a lot of this. There's still a paucity of research, I would say, in terms of the amount of work that's being done. We received funding about 5 years ago, I guess, from Dairy Farmers of Canada, part of the Dairy Research Cluster 3 project to do a large national study on robotic milking in Canada. And so that started in 2018, whereby we did a benchmarking study of close to 200 robot farms in Canada. That benchmark study was initially led by a former graduate student of mine, Robert Matson, and Robert's here in the room. For those that are online, Robert's here with us, and I bugged him that he could actually do some presenting, but he doesn't want to. So Robert did this project starting in 2019, defended his thesis in the fall of 21, right?
2020, yeah.
Was it 2020? Okay, so that's 3 years ago. Time flies. And has worked in industry for a couple of years in the dairy nutrition business, and now has taken on a role with Dairy Farmers of Ontario and their coordinating their research program there. When Robert did this project, we started off by basically recruiting a large sample of farms, close to 200 farms across Canada. And the initial part of that study was to do a benchmark of basically what those herds look like and also quantifying production differences and then trying to make associations of production and management on those farms. And so Robert published 2 papers coming out of his master's work, one on national data involving these 197 farms, looking primarily at associations of housing and management with production outcomes on those farms. And then we published a second study focused specifically on a subset of farms, 75 farms from Ontario, looking at lameness prevalence on those farms and associating, again, herd management, housing with lameness prevalence. For the national study, as cited here on the screen, we basically had all the milk test data from these farms, and that's what we used as our production benchmark for those farms. For the secondary paper that we published, we actually had the actual robot data, and we're actually able to look at milking visits and all those kind of things. For this national benchmark, though, we did not have all that milking data complete at the time. Since that time, we have put that together, and that's part of the work that Brandon's actually been looking at. Part of this benchmark study, we found a lot of different associations with production on these farms. Some of those, or some of the primary ones, I guess I could say, were associated with feeding management on these farms. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of results that we found to set up kind of where we went with this data. So this is just one example. This is a paper we published last year. This was actually led by a visiting student from Brazil, Marcelo Castro, specifically looking at a subset of farms. Again, of those 197 farms, we had 120 farms from Ontario and Quebec. And from those 120 farms, we had all their bulk tank fatty acid data. And we were able to look at the association of the bulk tank fatty acid profile of those farms with, again, management. And this is just one example where we see that those herds that were delivering feed more frequently, it's covered up here, but it's 3 times a day or more, had a significantly higher proportion of de novo fatty acids in their bulk tank milk, which would be indicative of basically a more stable rumen environment in those cows at a herd level, likely as a result of increased feed meal frequency in those cows as a result of greater feed delivery frequency, and potentially differences in feed quality potentially there as well. In addition to that, in part of Robert's research and the study he published in 2021, we also found that feed push-up frequency, so just feed access, was important on those farms. The majority of those farms, I think it was close to 2/3 of those farms, were using some kind of automated feed pusher system, with the average frequency being about 12 times a day. Lots of variation around that mean frequency of feed push-ups, but across that range that we observed across those herds, every 5 extra feed pushes was about 0.35 kilos more milk. And so not a dramatic kind of increase, but if you look at it kind of across the range of farms, that was separating, probably predicting anywhere from 2 to 3 kilos difference in milk production between herds based on how often feed was getting pushed up on those farms. Similarly, another result related to feed and feed access was feeding space and feed bunk space on those farms. And across those study herds, the 197 farms that Robert studied, we had a mean amount of feed bunk space of 64 centimeters, or just over 2 feet of feed bunk space. Again, lots of variation around that. And in the case of this model, we found that every 10 centimeter increase in bunk space across the range that we observed on those farms, we associated that with about 0.3 kilograms more milk. And so, again, suggesting that feed and feed access was important, not only from an availability, but also from a space standpoint. Now, what was kind of missing as part of Robert's project was, well, I guess, 2 things. Was one, we didn't have all the robot data complete in terms of milking activity and visits and all that at that time point. Plus, we didn't have the actual nutrient composition and dietary composition of those study farms. That was part of our original objectives. We started to collect that data. We took feed samples on those farms, but actually getting nutritionist data took a long time period to achieve. And most of that was actually done during the summer of 2020, which was done remotely. That summer we had planned to go back on farm, but we couldn't. And so we had to do that remotely. So a lot of communication by email and phone trying to collect that information from those various nutritionists for 197 farms across Canada. And so that was basically became kind of the focus of at least the first chapter of Brandon's PhD research. And I'm going to invite Brandon to come up, and he's going to present basically what he did as far as kind of looking at some of those dietary differences and relating that to production on these farms.
Yeah, so as mentioned, I took over the study and looked more on the nutritional side after Robert had set the foreground for me with his studies. And so two of the main specific objectives we had was to describe the variation in nutrient composition that was being fed, as well as the dietary ingredients included on these farms across Canada that were milking with automated milking systems. And then with that, we wanted to see what part of those factors or dietary components and nutrients were actually associated with the different levels of milk production and milking behaviors that we were able to record. So with that, we used about 177 of those farms that were on the 197 that was previously mentioned. Again, they all had to be AMS farms and had milk records monthly. And so when we visited those farms initially in April to September 2019, again, we used those management and farm layout data that was collected then. We also used the monthly milk test data that was again collected from April 2019 to 2020, which was our study period of focus. We again collected the robot data during this time period, both while we visited as well as throughout the study period via team viewer. And then lastly, we collected that nutritional feeding strategy information, both diet formulations, as well as the composition ingredients that were included from these farms. And so just a little background on the farm demographics that were included on my study, slightly different than those that were included on Robert's. We had about 126 lactating cows, with farms averaging about 2.7 AMS units per farm. Cows were averaging 171 days of milk with a parity of 2.4, and their production levels are about 37 kilos a day with a milk fat and protein content of about 4.1 and a 3.4. So when we look at our nutrient composition of the diets, when we summarize those both nationally and by region, we included about 149 farms or 150 farms on PMR based on the information we were able to receive from nutritionists, and 157 farms supplied sufficient information from an AMS concentrate standpoint. And as you can see, from a dry matter intake standpoint, farms on average were about around that 25 kilos per day of dry matter intake, again, formulations. But more specifically, what we want to point out here, the lines that were actually bolded are, and again, obviously with the box on our screen, it's hard to see some of the p-values, but actually those lines were ones that were showing regional differences and regional variations between those macronutrient values that we incorporated. And so we just want to reiterate that there's a lot of variation, as you can see, both from the standard errors as well as just the regional differences in feeding strategies and targeted formulated nutrients incorporated on these farms. We also categorize these farms based on their major ingredient in the AMS, what they fed through the concentrate, and a large majority of them did feed some sort of wheat product in that in their concentrate. And as you can see, the different colors represent the different regions. And as you can see, most of our Ontario farms were in this region, as well as most of the Eastern, again, with a small inclusion of Eastern farms. And then the second most common was our corn, mostly dry corn or high moisture corn. And then our third grouping was barley. This again was majority in the Western region, just based on mostly where the barley is grown. And again, this is just the major ingredient, so it doesn't say that there isn't corn or barley in the other wheat farms, and vice versa for the other groups. So in addition to, we also categorized our farms by the primary forage offered on those farms. And again, we did this by region as well. So by no surprise, corn silage was the most popular and most prominent primary forage fed on dairy farms. And then next being haylage, which includes both, oh, what person in? Oh, someone else did. Okay. And then haylage, which actually included both grass silage, or included grass, alfalfa, as well as mixed silages. And then last being barley silage, which again was mainly grown or predominantly grown in Western regions, included there as well. So with this, our statistical model for this portion of the study was actually a multifactorial study where we looked at, again, our outcomes of being milk production, milk fat, and protein yield, as well as milking visits. And we checked all variables using proc univariate for normality, and then used the proc mix to look at individual ingredients univariably to see if they would be retained with the p-value less than 0.025. Once those were figured out if they were retained, then we checked for correlations between those variables using proc core before putting all those remaining variables in a final multivariable model where we use stepwise backward elimination, removing the largest p-value each time until we resulted in a p-value less than 0.01. And as you can't see, we use significance under 0.05. We also tested 3 potential covariates in this model, which being herd average days in milk, herd average parity, as well as breed on those farms, just as we expected those potentially to affect our production and milking visits as well. And we just wanted to control for that within our model. So we just include this table. We won't go through all the numbers, but more or less these are most of the factors that we'll discuss in the coming slides. But we just wanted to stress the variation that was observed. And for those in the room, I have a laser, and obviously online you can't see, but just the ones to point out drastic differences in where feed push-up was 0, and I believe it goes to like 32 or 38. And the feed bung space ranged from 0.1 meters all the way up to, I believe it was like 1.25 or greater. So just a large variation between farms, and like you can see the rest of them. So some of these variables came out and feel like they're a small difference, but when you again look at the range that we're looking at among these farms, they do add up to quite a significant difference from the top and bottom. So to look at our first associated factor with milk yield, primary forage fed on farm was actually associated. So when we look at our barley silage, so the blue bar for those in the room is barley silage compared to our reference, which is the haylage, which is the gray bar. We see an associated increase about 2.2 kilograms of milk higher on those farms compared to our haylage. Again, we need to make sure we consider that the primary forage of barley was fed on mostly wheat or on Western farms, and so this was confounded with region. So if this is solely based on barley, we are not for sure, and we aren't obviously able to detect that for sure, and it could be other factors involved as well. And with that, we also saw a tendency for corn corn silage fed on farm to also be associated with, or tend to be associated with, about another kilo or 1.25-ish kilos of milk, again, compared to that haylage farm, or those farms feeding haylage. In addition to primary forage, we also saw that as farms increased their fat supplementation, this also resulted in increased milk production on farm. The fat supplementation actually was correlated with the PMR energy density as well. So overall, as you increase the energy density of the diet, we saw an increase in milk production, which would be expected when we're supplementing the fat. Similarly, that fat supplementation was also a result that we saw associated with our milk fat yield. As expected, when you increase our fat supplementation, again, about half to 65% of that can go towards increased milk fat potentially, based on what that fat supplement profile is, as well as what the base diet is including as well. So again, every percentage point increase in PMR crude fat protein or crude fat increase was associated with about 0.05 kilograms increase in fat yield. In addition, we saw that as we increased 10 percentage points in percent dry matter of our total diet, this is associated with an increase of about 0.07 kilograms a day of milk fat. Again, 10 percentage points may sound like a lot, but when our diets are spread, I believe from any, I think it was like a 30 or 40 point spread, it can add up quickly. And then lastly, as we increase our total crude protein of the diet, we actually saw an associated decrease in our milk fat yield. In our actual thesis, we suggest this may not be biologically significant, as our points only vary about 3 percentage points from our top to bottom. And we suggest that this may just be a nutrient imbalance within our diets too as well. So when we look at our milk protein yield, again, as we increase that nutrient density of the PMR, we see an associated increase of milk protein. So as we increase by 0.1 megacalories per kilogram, this was associated with a 0.02 kilogram increase from a milk protein standpoint. And our thoughts here is if we were supplying more energy in the diet, this requires the animal to use less of their amino acids in circulation for glucose use in the body or energy use in the body for either milk or for body tissue, and allows that amino acid to go towards milk production. In addition, as we increase our PMR percent of the forage, again by 10 percentage points, we again see that increase or associated increase in milk protein by about 0.05 kilograms per day. And lastly, as we increase our dry matter percent dry matter of the total diet by 10 percentage points, this again was associated with about 0.05 kilograms per day increase in our milk protein. So we move on to our milking visits, or what we're calling milking behaviors. Our farms that were using a free flow traffic system, and for those that don't know, free flow means that they have free access to all the resources in their pen, versus guided flow, meaning that they have a predetermined sequence of access to their resources. We saw that the free flow actually had 0.62 visits more per day that ended in milkings compared to those with a guided flow system. In addition, we observed, similar to previous studies that were mentioned by Trevor, as we increase feed availability through feed push-ups, we increase our feed or our milking visits at the robot. So for every 10 milking or 10 feed push-ups, we see about 0.1 more visits per day per cow. Now starting to talk about nutrition, we see that as we increase our nutrient density, or the NFC percent of our PMR by 10 percentage points, is associated with actually a reduction in our visits. And we attribute this to increasing our nutrient density of the PMR may make lazy cows, or cows that aren't drawn towards the robot as often, since we are supplementing energy or feed through theirs to entice them to come. This may allow them to be less motivated to get that, since they're getting all the energy they may need through the PMR at the bunk. In addition, kind of the opposite direction, as we increase our forage percent of the total diet, this resulted again in a reduction in milking visits, suggesting that if we're feeding a diet too high in forage, maybe they're not getting enough energy and they have reduced milk production in general, resulting in less need for that milking visit. So overall, again, just a part of my thesis research, but we observed great variation when we come to talk about the nutritional strategies, especially the nutrient composition of those diets from both AMS concentrate and a PMR standpoint. These nutritional factors that we described, again, should be points that we discuss with our nutritionists and farmers on these farms, as we potentially better formulate diets to help maximize our production, as well as health and milking behaviors. And lastly, it gets cut off a little bit again, but the PMR nutrients content may be a little bit more important than those being described in the AMS concentrate. Just based on our models, we just didn't have any AMS concentrate variables that were retained in our models. Not saying that they're not important still, but just based on the focus of the research so far has mostly been focused on the AMS concentrate quantity and what we're feeding there, but we should probably focus just as much energy or focus on that PMR as well. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Trevor.
Great, thanks, Brendan. Yeah, so that's just a snippet of kind of some of the results from that national study in terms of looking at some of these associations between the diets fed on these farms and some of the production outcomes that we have. Another focus of our national, our dairy cluster project was actually to look at specifically how some of these nutritional variations on farm also related to health on these farms, and we've done a couple of different actually analysis related to that. So we have some work related to udder health and also related to early lactation health in terms of specifically related to ketosis on these farms. And that's actually a second chapter in Brandon's thesis he's not going to be talking about today. Specifically the results of that, he will talk about those specifically tomorrow during his thesis exam. But one of the reasons why we were interested in this or kind of delving into this is a study that actually was done here at the University of Guelph about 6 years ago. So this was part of the PhD work of Elise Tatone. She was a student of Todd Duffield's over in population medicine. And Elise's thesis was focused around ketosis in dairy cows. And one of the analysis that she did was a study of close to 800 farms in Ontario, looking at their first test milk BHB values from Lactanet. And specifically, one of the findings that Elise had in that project was the fact that she saw almost a 1.5-fold increase in ketosis risk based on milk BHB, elevated milk BHB of 0.15 millimoles per liter, versus basically cows that were milked in conventional systems. And so that got us thinking about whether or not, and at the same time over the years, the last 5 years or so, we've heard that anecdotally from some producers, from some nutritionists, that they were seeing elevated BHBs in these cows in robots. Now, jumping right into actually some of Brandon's results that I threw into here, we took, again, from a sample of those herds that were originally studied going back to 2018, we had data from 162 farms where we were able to look at, across almost a 2-year period of time, the prevalence rates of elevated milk BHB in cows on first test. And so basically looking at first test milk test data from those farms, we looked at whether or not those cows on those farms had elevated milk BHBs. And these are just the averages. So 22% average across cows, not too surprisingly, lower in first lactation animals and elevated in our multiparous cows, where we would expect to see higher BHB levels. Now, what's kind of interesting about this number, that's 22%, is that if we look at kind of studies that have been published over the years looking at elevated BHBs in cows, we see that that number hasn't really varied considerably. There's some studies that have higher numbers, some that have lower, but we see some averages that are very close to that. So going back 50, 60 years, looking at different studies that have tried to quantify elevated BHBs, both at a blood level as well as a milk level in cows, we see numbers that hover sometimes higher, sometimes lower. But particularly in the last, let's say, 10 years, some of the studies that have been done here in Canada, we see numbers that are quite similar to that, around 22% across cows. And so if anything, what this is saying is that this is not necessarily, we're not necessarily seeing any improvements in these farms. Now, some of the argument that's being made, particularly in the last few years, is that when we see elevated BHBs, it's not necessarily always an issue. It might just be the fact that these are higher producing cows. Are these necessarily clinical ketosis cases? Not necessarily. Maybe it's just the fact that these are higher producing cows. They're mobilizing more fat, and as a result of that, we see elevated BHB levels. And to that point, if we look at actually the production of the farms, the MS farms in Canada, and again, going back to Robert's thesis research, when we look at the average production of those herds at the time of study, if we compare it to our Canadian national average for Holstein herds, we do see that these herds are producing about 2 kilograms per day more in milk production. And so maybe there is something to that point, that maybe it is the higher production that's just driving some of these differences in milk or ketone levels, and specifically milk ketone levels that we're seeing in these farms. Maybe there's something there, but again, if we kind of jump back in time a little bit, we published a study in 2018. So this was PhD work of Dr. Megan King, a former PhD student of mine, now faculty at University of Manitoba. Part of Megan's thesis research, she did a fairly large study on commercial farms, again, drawing blood on cows in early lactation and diagnosing subclinically ketosis based on elevated blood BHB in that first kind of week to 2 weeks in milk. And in this case, using a 1.2 cutoff, using a handheld ketone meter. What Megan found, which was very interesting, was the fact that those farms, those cows on those farms that were diagnosed with subclinical ketosis based on that elevated blood BHB, yes, actually had higher milk production in the first 7 to 10 days in milk, but they lost that advantage once they got past about 10 days in milk, and their milk production levels basically regressed, so to speak. They didn't have as steep an incline anymore, and basically we lost that advantage. And so while it appears that, yes, those cows initially were higher producing cows, which might fit with that kind of suggestion that that's what's driving that, the reality is that in this case, that is coming with a negative consequence. And that negative consequence is that we're not basically keeping that advantage in terms of milk production. What was kind of interesting in the case of this study was that when we looked at specifically how those cows were being fed on those farms from a robot standpoint, this is the amount of supplement that the cows were receiving in the robots across these farms. This was done on 5 commercial dairy farms, the study, with a sample of about 600 cows. What we see is that the level of supplementation is basically static between those two groups of cows. And that's because at the time, all these farms were basically using a fixed feeding table in their robots. So basically the cows got the same amount of feed regardless of their level of milk production. Generally in robots, as cows get to some point in days in milk, then we put them on what we call a production-based feed table, whereby the cows that are higher producing will get a higher amount of feed in the robot based on their production level. Now, at this time, most of these farms weren't going onto a production-based feed table to at least 30 days in milk, some of them up to 60 days in milk. And so that's why we don't see any difference here. We are starting to see a little bit difference in there where people are going earlier now, kind of going anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, getting them onto a production-based feed table. What's interesting in this case, if we look at it another way here, this is the amount of milk kind of produced per cow based on the amount or kilogram of supplement received in the robot. Again, we see that difference in that first week to 10 days in milk there, which would suggest that, yeah, there's probably something lacking in terms of these cows, that maybe these cows are just not getting enough energy into them in the first week to 10 days. Suggesting that probably, like I said before, we do need to get them on a production, those higher producing cows, probably on a production table earlier, but then whether or not there's something else that might be lacking in that first 10 days. One of the concerns there is we don't want to put those cows on too much grain too quickly. That might have a negative impact on their PMR consumption, like how much feed they're actually consuming at the feed bunk, as well as the fact that if it's a fairly high starch pellet or something like that, that could also cause some rumen disruption as well, especially if they're only visiting that robot a few times a day and they're consuming a large amount of grain at an individual time point, which could throw the rumen off during that time period as well. And so, again, raises lots of questions of why we might then see this kind of energy deficit in these cows in that early time period. And just a few points I wanted to make. Number one is, and I think that's can't be overlooked in any of these situations, is that often when we have kind of negative outcomes in early lactation, specifically energy balance issues in cows in early lactation, it's often correlated to overconditioning. And those overconditioned cows and often result of poor management in the previous lactation can go back to reproductive management in the previous lactation. Often it's in robot herds, it could be poor feeding management in the later half of their lactation where they're putting on too much condition. That can lead to low dry matter intake in those cows and that kind of failure to really take off in early lactation. And then, as I was just describing too, we often see a failure to consume enough energy in those cows in that first couple of weeks of lactation. And part of that is making sure cows get to the robot. So that's just more practically, are they even getting to their robot frequently? And a target would be at least 3 times a day or more, just to make sure that we're not only getting good mammary gland proliferation in those cows and getting that mammary gland set up, but then also making sure the cows are getting the feed that they're allocated, making sure they go on that production-based feed table by 10 to 14 days, like I said. And then making sure, yeah, we get the right nutrients into those cows in that early time period. And that's been another area that we've been looking at is can we actually get maybe alternative or different nutrients or more energy into those cows in that time period and have positive impacts. And so one of the questions we've been looking at again over the last number of years is there opportunities to strategically supplement those cows to reduce the risk of negative energy balance and ketosis in those cows? And our kind of ideas have been focused around alternative energy sources. So things that are going to supply glucose or gluconeogenic precursors to those cows without necessarily having a negative impact on the rumen environment. So alternatives basically to increasing starch consumption in those cows. And so a first study we did was related to feeding molasses. So molasses is high in sugar. 40% or higher in sugar content, and our idea was there is could we get some more sugar into those cows in the first few weeks of lactation and see a positive impact. And so we did a study again in and around 2018, so 5 years ago already. And this was master's work of Sydney Moore, former master student in my lab, where we supplemented cows. Basically, we gave them their regular robot concentrate for the first 3 weeks of milk, but then also supplemented them with a liquid molasses on top of that. And what Sydney observed, not earth-shattering results, but what she observed was that the number of positive subclinical ketosis tests, so basically elevated BHB, blood BHB in those cows, was reduced, or multiple tests were reduced in those cows that were supplemented. So, but the reality is in the study, and you can see this is cows that never had an elevated test, those numbers were only in the 40 to 50% range. So 50% of the cows in the case of the study were still, and again, this is on a large sample of cows, close to 400 cows, 50% of those cows were still testing with high beet milk BHBs in the first few weeks of milk. And the difference here we saw was that basically the difference between cows that had 3 or more positive tests over the first 3 weeks of lactation. So again, maybe a positive result, but not necessarily the answer, so to speak, that we wanted. Another product that we've had a little bit of research experience with over the last few years is glycerol. And again, glycerol is a byproduct of the biodiesel industry. Again, a rapidly fermented energy source that can be provided to cows. Brandon actually is going to be presenting on some of that work as part of his PhD work tomorrow as well. He did actually a study at the Elora Dairy looking at glycerol supplementation of cows in a PMR as well as in a dry cow feed, both pre-calving and post-calving in a factorial design, where we did see some positive impacts in terms of energy balance in those cows in early lactation. And our other idea, or other kind of focus, was to think about, could we actually incorporate something like that into a robot pellet that we would provide then on farm? And so that was the focus of Clay's master's research. And so I'm going to hand it over to Clay to present some of that work. So.
Yeah, so thanks, Trevor. My name is Clay. I'm a master's student in Trevor's lab. And as he mentioned, the objective of my study was to look at how the effects of supplementing dry glycerol to fresh cows through the AMS pellet affected their health and production. And we were hypothesizing that supplying glycerol to the early lactation cows will improve their energy balance in early lactation and increase milk yield up to 150 days, which was the observation period. So to do this study and supplement the fresh cows with glycerol, we added dry glycerol to the AMS pellet, which was delivered through the AMS in the first 21 days in milk. This was done on 5 commercial dairy farms milking with AMS systems. Across the 5 farms, they summed 1,200 milking cows with 29 robots. And the criteria for these farms to be recruited was simply that they're able to feed 2 types of concentrate through their robots. Their minimum lactating size of 120 cows, and they're within an hour and a half of the university. And again, we formulated the treatment pellet to target minimum intake of 250 grams of the glycerol product per cow. So this was using the base formulation of whatever pellet was used on each individual farm and adding it ended up being about 62.5 kilos of glycerol per ton of pellet based on their average feeding rate through that first 21 days of milk. And the study began in May of 2022 with the first cows being recruited and the last cows recruited in December of 2022. And then that observation period went into May of 2023 to get those cows to their 150 days of milk. So enrolling these cows, treatments were randomly assigned 21 days prior to calving, blocking for parity, so primiparous and multiparous cows. The control group received the base farm pellet from 0 to 21 days of milk, and then that continued for the following 150 days, whereas the treatment cows for that first 21 days of milk received the glycerol pellet. So that again was the base pellet plus targeting 250 grams per day of that glycerol product. And then at day 22, they switched from the glycerol pellet to the farm's base pellet, and that continued up to 150 days of milk. The feed tables designed for the treatment cows were designed to offer an extra 250 grams per cow per day to ensure that they were getting that 250 grams of glycerol. So in the formulation process, the glycerol was added on top of the base formulation. So technically that diluted some of the pellet ingredients. So we added an extra 250 grams of, or programmed an extra 250 grams of concentrate through the robot to ensure that they're receiving the same micros. And the feed tables were created for the treatment cows in the first 21 days of milk, mirrored that of the control cows. So if they switched to a yield table at day 8, the treatment cows also switched to a milk yield table at day 8. And then at day 21, the glycerol pellet was down to 0 kilos, and the base pellet went to whatever the feed table is offering, which was typically around 4 kilos. And at the end of the study, the goal was to enroll 200 cows per treatment group. So there were 210 control cows and 177 glycerol cows. And that was because there are some cows who did not meet the minimum 250 gram target intake of glycerol. So they were not used in the data set. And the data we collected, so we visited these herds twice a week for 8 months. And we collected body condition and locomotion scores 21 days prior to calving when they were enrolled. And then at calving, 21 days, 42, and 63 days after calving for body condition and locomotion. Blood samples were taken about 1 week before calving, and then days 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15 days after calving. That's plus or minus 3 days of milk just for the schedule of when we actually visited the herds. And then we observed these cows up to 150 days of milk through the AMS software to download any production and behavior data. The analyses on this data was done through SAS. So for AMS data, we were looking at concentrate intake, milkings, milk yield, and rumination minutes. The health data was blood BHB, blood glucose, serum NEFA, and body condition score. The fixed effects of parity and days of milk were included in the mixed models if the p-value was less than 0.1, and covariates were tested for significance and included in the model if they were again a p-value less than 0.1, and any interactions were also remained in the model if the p-value was less than 0.1. And again, the data was tested for normality using proc univariate, and then univariable models were done to see which p-values were below 0.25 to be included in the multivariable analyses. And then any variables that were below p of 0.1 were maintained in the mixed models. So getting into the results, this is the robot pellet intake, which is, I guess, technically the concentrate delivered through the AMS. We cannot actually say for sure whether or not the cows consumed everything they were offered. And you can see here in these models were done in the treatment period and the observation period. So the first 21 days of milk were analyzed separately from the observation, which was day 22 to 150. And in that first 21 days of milk, there was a treatment by day of milk interaction. But looking into that interaction, it was actually right around the time where the feed table switched from cows receiving the glycerol pellet and onto the base pellet. And just the way the software programs that allocation, it did drop their allocation around day 21, but excluding that little end of the treatment period, the cows did on average receive or were delivered 260 grams additional concentrate, which met our targeted 250 grams. And then following that observation period from 22 to 150, again, there was a treatment by day and milk interaction. And looking into that, it was actually only at day 22. So every day after day 22, there was no treatment by day and milk interaction. And across those 150 days on average, the cows were delivered 160 grams more concentrate. And then looking at successful milkings per day, again, this is done in the treatment and analyzing the treatment and observation period separately. There was a significant increase in milkings per day for the glycerol cows. They were milked had 0.15 more successful milkings per day than control cows in the first 21 days. And then from days 22 to 150, these cows had an average of 0.11 more successful milkings per day. And that, yeah, just the carryover effect of the treatment was seen. And then going into milk yield. So this is the milk yield collected from the AMS. During the treatment period, there was a tendency for the glycerol cows to have 1.1 kilos more milk yield per day. And then from days 22 to 150, there was actually a significant increase in milk yield where the glycerol cows yielded on average of 1.5 kilos per day. And across these 150 days, that averaged about 250 kilos more yield per cow through 150 days. What's driving this interaction? Not sure. Is it that the cows are yielding more milk, so then they have 0.15 more milkings per day, or is the extra milkings per day potentially leading to a little more milk yield? I'm still trying to think that one through myself. Maybe the blood metabolite data would show that. So then moving into the metabolic status of the cows, this gray line here is indicating the day of calving. So the -7 sample was used as a covariate for the postpartum blood NEFA. And the blood NEFA was analyzed at days 2 and 5. There was no significant difference in treatment means. This potentially is because maybe should have followed this out a little later for the cows to have been on the glycerol product for more than 5 days to see that difference. Hindsight. And then looking at the blood glucose, again, -7 was used as a covariate. Gray line indicates calving. There was in this model a treatment by sample interaction at days, I guess it was sample 3 and sample 4, where control cows had a higher blood glucose level than the glycerol cows. This may be due to more glucose being partitioned to milk production because these cows were yielding more milk. They may be using more of their blood glucose just to make that milk rather than use it within their own system. But that was only at days 9 and 12, and there were no differences at the other samples. And then looking at blood BHB, again, -7 used as a covariate. Gray line indicates calving. The only significant treatment by sample interaction was at sample number 2, which was around 5 days of milk, where the glycerol cows did have a higher blood BHB. But looking at the way that, so the glycerol was formulated in the pellet, so that glycerol may have been fermented in the rumen, and it's typically, or the majority of glycerol fermented turns into butyrate, which can be directly absorbed through the rumen as BHB. So that higher BHB may just be the glycerol showing up in the blood of these cows as they were consuming it. So then we decided to look at how did cows with a high body condition score versus a normal body condition score, what did their incidence of BHB over 1.2 look like? So we broke this down by cows with at the -21 days of milk. If their body condition score was equal to or greater than 3.5 versus cows who were less than 3.5. And if they had one sample that was above the BHB cutoff of 1.2. So we can see here that blue is control cows, orange is glycerol. There was a significant interaction within control cows for high body condition score prepartum. They were 3.5 times more likely to have a BHB sample greater than 1.2. And this interaction was not seen within the glycerol treatment group. So the fat control cows were the most likely to have a high BHB sample. And then looking at the body condition score of the cows, so 21 days prior to calving day, this was the sample taken right after calving, and then up to 63 days of milk. And there was a treatment by sample interaction at 63 days of milk, where the glycerol cows actually had a higher body condition score than the control cows. And 63 days of milk was right around the peak milk yield for these cows. So these glycerol cows may be maintaining their body condition better through the early lactation than the control cows were. So the conclusions from the study, supplementing glycerol to fresh cows improved milking behavior and milk production through the first 21 days of milk when they were receiving the glycerol. And then this carried through up to 150 days of milk. Overconditioned cows that were not receiving glycerol were at an increased risk of high BHB. The opposite of that is that overconditioned cows who were receiving glycerol were not any more likely to test higher for BHB. And then glycerol supplemented cows maintained a higher body condition score up to peak lactation. And some take-home messages.
Yeah, well, we'll just really quickly wrap this up so we have some time for a few questions from the audience. So yeah, we know that robot milking has a lot of opportunities. Nutritional management, in addition to other management, housing, other management being important, obviously, on these farms. Nutritional management is key as well. So feeding management, which we described, dietary formulation, there seems to be some impact there. And then also this idea that we have opportunities for more precision feeding. Now, again, there's lots of challenges with that as well, but some of the data that we've generated to date does kind of point to that opportunity. So just really quickly, thanks to various people that funded a lot of this work, particularly the Dairy Farmers of Canada through Dairy Research Cluster and Lactanet for helping with data provision, as well as various other government and industry partners in a lot of the work that we've shown. And hopefully we can answer a few questions yet. And I'm going to make these guys answer them. So
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Questions? If you have questions online, you can put your hand up, or you can unmute yourself and come on and ask a question. But any questions?
One for Clayton. On your graphs, both the groups dropped at around 30 days of milk, the number of visits.
Yeah.
What do you think that was?
Yeah, so I didn't see that till after the study was done. And then going back, predominantly these herds, the majority of cows in the study were milked on Laley robots. And then I ended up just looking at the milk access settings on the software. And at day 30, the software is designed for cows to be yielding 12 kilos of milk per milking versus in the first 30 days, the cutoff is 8. So you can see that where cows have to be yielding, it expects them to be yielding more milk. So then those just, number of milkings per day drops off.
yeah, and you can see a bit, we talked about this morning, actually, like you see it on the milk yield, you see a little bit, like you're losing a tiny bit of peak there, I think, right? That's right at that 30 days. Like there's just a tiny little inflection there, right? But I think that's there is a loss associated with that, which is something the robot companies I think should take a peek at, or people designing milk. It's between feed settings and milk settings on these farms. But
Clay, if I understood what you did here correctly, you sorted based on cows that made the intake threshold into the glycerol or control group, correct?
No, within the glycerol group,
Yep.
if they weren't delivered the 250 grams of glycerol within the
No,
first
it's all-
21 days.
Have you considered running this data as a correlation based on glycerol intake versus as a category? I'm using bad stats words, Jen. Sorry. Okay. But that those ones that were intermediate intakes, where they would fall in this? Because I think one of the things you need to make sure is that you haven't just sorted cows that have higher supplement intake, full stop. If you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it's tough because depending on the set, like the software, how it allocates the concentrate, if if a cow may not have gone to the robot to meet that concentrate delivery within the days, then yeah, it restricts how much glycerol they can be given. But while it's reality on farm, we're trying to see how the glycerol itself performed. So if they weren't getting the 250 grams of glycerol, I personally think it's okay to exclude them because we're trying to identify the effects of the glycerol itself. So by excluding them, we're not actually meeting like the criteria of the study that they received the glycerol. Because if like you could drench a cow glycerol once a day to determine the effects, but this was to see how it performed delivered through the robot.
But to Christoph's point, yeah, I know your committee asked you to take a look at those cows we did exclude, right, to see what. So that is something we will look at, is kind of, yeah, what was happening with those cows, right? Now, the challenge with that too is that like it's a chicken and egg thing, right? Because those cows in this case were going on production tables anywhere from what was it?
8 to 12.
8 to 12 days of milk. And so if those cows were getting a boost of energy and they were starting to produce more, then they would be allocated more concentrate too, right? And so you would have had that for control cows and glycerol, but right, if the glycerol was having that effect, that would actually push their intake a little bit higher. So yeah, we might be excluding kind of those cows that had a lower kind of start in milk production on the glycerol treatment, just because they're, yeah. So looking into those cows for sure is going to be interesting. But we wanted to make sure we're trying to get our target amount into the cows. So yeah.
I do have a question I lied. So when you look at that 20 to 30 day where they peak off, is that to do with the cow's time budget? Do they start going less to the robot, or is that an allocation of resources issue? What was the kind of trade-off, like what was happening at that time frame? When they all of a sudden they had a little bit of a plateau in their peak, and then they may have recovered a little bit later on, but
I mean, as we saw with I think it's the milk access settings that was changing that. At that point, the cows were all on a production-based feed table. Both groups were receiving the same base pellet. So I think that drop is just a symptom of the change in the milk access setting at 30 days.
Time for maybe one more question. Anybody online, question?
Brandon looks bored.
Actually, maybe I have a question.
Sure.
For some of those linear regressions that you looked at, did you look at any nonlinear relationships across that data, especially since for some of those that you've had some large variabilities?
Short answer, no, we didn't. We did look at distributions, and they were pretty normally distributed, so we checked that first, and so that kind of led us to not start going down that path per se. So I mean, from the stats, crude stats wording, maybe we could have, but
you did look at them visually too, although we plotted them all out, right? To look for whether things were more linear versus if we saw any kind of distinct
Yeah.
So yeah, we did visually, but not statistically. We didn't necessarily start diving into any of those per se from a modeling standpoint.
Good. Okay, then let's thank our speaker one more time. Great, so thanks, guys. I believe our next CNM seminar speaker will be from Dave Huben's lab, so on the fish side. So stay tuned for that invite soon. And thanks very much for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for doing all those questions, man.